cemetery in my small hometown comes to mind when I think back on my early years. It was a modest place with old, silent graves, and tall cypress trees stood like motionless sentinels. It was dark and imposing back then, but I didn't find it frightening because I saw it as a peaceful place to escape from my routine and a kind of playground that no other child dared to enter. I used to slip through the rusty iron gate and run between the headstones without the slightest frightened. In some way, my curiosity compelled me to explore every inch of it, and I was captivated by the inscriptions on the plaques. I felt invincible because of my childish ignorance and lack of awareness of the weight of death. I met my supposed friend there, and he told me his name was Philip. He always showed up around the oldest headstones, especially during the day, though occasionally I caught a glimpse of him at dusk. He never mentioned his family or his origins, but he told me stories about how he enjoyed hiding behind the mums and how he could climb the tallest trees to see the entire cemetery as if it were a huge playground. We never had lengthy conversations, but he was always there and strangely comforting. He had a serious expression, and his large eyes stood out against his pale face. Since he told me it made sense in my child's mind, I simply assumed he lived there. At times, I amused myself by running beside him through the rows of crosses, and at other times, I bring small stones to toss against a loose tombstone. Even though the circumstances were strange, afternoons became our time together. My mother didn't initially suspect my connection to the graveyard. She was aware that I would wander there, but she thought it was my favorite hiding place where I liked to sketch or observe the birds. She didn't often reprimand me. The night everything changed, though, when she noticed that I was speaking to someone, which startled her because I was meant to be by myself in my room. She asked me who I was talking to, and I said without hesitation, "Philip." My mother became pale, shut the door, and whispered, "What am I talking about?" I didn't understand her anxiety, so I was just perplexed. She ended up rushing me to the cemetery and demanding that I show her where I played with that enigmatic friend. I followed her shaky steps without understanding why she was so alarmed. I led her there in the hopes that she would reprimand me or something. When we arrived at the oldest section of the cemetery, she pointed to a specific grave that was covered in moss and appeared to be in poor condition. You could see the name Philip on the grimy, nearly unreadable plaque. She told me in a tremulous voice that this was the boy you had been talking to from that point on. My mother had nightmares and prevented me from going back to that location, leaving me speechless. Looking back on that scene objectively, it makes me shudder. She had verified something I couldn't believe. Wasn't a living boy, but a tiny ghost still wandering that graveyard. Days after that discovery, my routine abruptly changed. My mother kept a close eye on me, made me do chores, and wouldn't let me go out by myself. Once, my afternoons for meeting my friend turned into long hours spent in my room trying to draw or staring out the window thinking about him. I wondered if Philip was sad, if he missed me, or if his loneliness in that abandoned place had gotten worse without my company. At night, I heard a light tapping on my window, and I thought I saw a small figure disappearing out of the corner of my eye. Every time I turned my head, I knew it was him, and the strange bond we had formed proved to be stronger than my fear. One afternoon, I was able to slip out while my mother was sleeping, as she had been losing sleep. I made the decision to go back to my previous mischief. As I walked among the graves in search of Philip, I noticed that everything seemed empty with no signs of life or death. It was as though the cemetery were holding its breath. I shuddered as I passed through the rusty gate and smelled the distinct smell of damp earth and withered flowers. I was able to identify the grave where my mother had revealed his name and the date of his passing. I waited for a few minutes for any indication that he was there. As I turned to leave, I felt a slight tug on my shirt sleeve as twilight began to ruin the day. And there he was, as usual, with his big eyes and solemn face. A shiver went down my spine as if all the warmth in my blood had suddenly disappeared. But I couldn't tell if it was an empty gesture or a shy smile. I stammered as I greeted him, and he didn't answer, but I could tell he understood because he nodded slightly. It felt like we were finally getting together after a long time apart, and I had the feeling that something more significant was coming up. Something I might come to regret asking for. After Philip began to move, I followed him around a line of headstones. He climbed onto a small brick wall that was almost completely in ruins with ease and slipped behind a big morsel. Leaves and broken twigs crunched underfoot as I moved carefully. The building was old, with somber angel sculptures on it. The metal door was chained shut, but my friend didn't need to open anything to enter. He just stayed behind the broken opaque glass, watching me through the cracks, and I thought he was pointing at something in the dark. I had the audacity to go up to that mausoleum and put my hand on the chain door to see what was going on inside. The place was red with moisture and confined, and the air was foul and stung my nose like it was full of something sickly. I was able to identify multiple niches that contained ancient NS, and a slight dizziness that caused me to stumble and drop to my knees. When I finally got my bearings and went to look for him again, he was nowhere to be seen. Night had fallen completely, and the only light coming from the moon was shining through the clouds. I started to hear footsteps and unidentifiable crackling noises in the distance. The next morning, my mother discovered me lying on the grass at the base of the melon. Her frantic screams roused me, and I couldn't recall how I got there. She reprimanded me and gave me a tight hug, saying we were leaving the area to escape what she described as my obsession, which caused my own emotions to spiral into guilt, confusion, and an inexplicable desire to see Philip again. She would take me to my aunt's house in a different town. This was the last time I was able to visit that cemetery as a child because my mother took me away with the sole purpose of releasing me from what she called that shadow from the past. Years later, when I turned 19, I returned to my hometown to settle some family matters. My mother had passed away, and I inherited the old house she owned. A flood of memories swept through me, but the one that kept coming back was the most persistent. Even though I believed in the supernatural, I'd never been able to find an explanation that made me feel better about the uncertainty surrounding Philip's true identity. I felt like I owed him something. Maybe a get-together or farewell would help me with my inquiries. I went to the house where I grew up and started going through documents and correspondence. I discovered a note written in my mother's unsteady handwriting, in which she claimed that the boy was not merely a ghost but rather the tortured relic of an earlier incident, and that what had happened that night was a curse hanging over our family. Reading her confession made me frightened because she admitted that she had witnessed Philip wandering when she was a child. She didn't say much more than that her parents had moved away and that she thought there was no sign of that ghostly boy when she returned as an adult. It wasn't until I mentioned a friend in the cemetery that she realized the story was being repeated. That night, I had trouble falling asleep, so I turned off all the lights and stayed in the dark while listening to the old house's beams. My eyelids trembled, and every shadow that drifted through the curtains seemed menacing. At around 3 in the morning, I got up and took a walk around the house, remembering a tiny room beneath the stairs where my mother kept old items that made her feel sad or afraid. Out of sheer curiosity, I chose to peek inside. I opened the small door and shone a flashlight inside, where I discovered a metal box full of old photographs, scraps of fabric, and papers. It was there that I saw his name once more. There was a sepia photograph of a group of children dressed in 1920, and at the far left was a face I instantly recognized. The same solemn expression, sunken gaze, and eyes too large for his slender frame. The picture itself didn't say much, but someone had written in shaky handwriting on the back, "Don't forget him. Every time Philip returns." Reading such a direct message sends a shiver down my spine. It took courage to face something so strange that had followed me since childhood. Early in the morning, I drove to the graveyard and found it almost exactly as I remembered, though a little more run down. The gate was still rusty, and the headstones were so worn that some no longer had legible inscriptions. My hands shook, and I leaned against the wall to try to process what I was holding. I closed the box and made a promise to myself that the following day I would return to the cemetery to see that old grave again. With a knot in my throat, I entered and went around every inch, my footsteps echoing in the silence that only comes from passing through such a quiet place. This time, I wasn't coming with innocence. Instead, I knew the danger and the strangeness around me, so that smell of mortality weighed more heavily on my chest than before. When I arrived at Philip's grave, I noticed that it was still covered in weeds and moss and in the same state as it had been years before. I bent over and used my sleeve to wipe some grime off the plaque before carefully reading the name. Philip Emerson, 1912 to 1920. I wondered how he died so young and if his parents were buried nearby. I couldn't find any indication of a family grave, so I lingered there in silence, feeling both strangely sad and warm inside. It didn't seem right in such a cold place, but then I felt the familiar tingling at the back of my neck, the same feeling I'd had as a child right before something unexplainable happened. I got up and looked around, but at first, I saw nothing. Then I heard a breeze rustling the dry leaves, followed by a faint sound like a footstep on gravel or perhaps someone breathing close to my ear. When I eventually plucked up the courage to turn around, I saw nothing but emptiness, and my breath caught in my throat as I made my way toward the old melon. I didn't dare turn around right away because I felt like a child was leaning on me while I was standing on tiptoe. I recalled the one with the dejected angels and the chain door. I gently pushed against its rusty gate and discovered it wasn't as secure as before. The chain broke with a slight yank, and the door creaked open for the first time in perhaps decades or even a century. My heart was racing, but I continued on. I looked around with my flashlight to make sure it was the same location as before: the niches, the broken end, and the coffin covered in cobwebs. Then I thought I heard a faint scrape behind me, so I spun around with my flashlight up and saw no one. I took a deep breath and went to the coffin because it was so old. There was a tiny cross carved into it, barely hanging on with shaky fingers. I reached for the lid, but a sudden bang sent me reeling back in fear. I pointed the flashlight at the door, and there was a small boy with his head bowed, wearing old, faded clothes just like in the old picture. His figure blocked the exit, and I could hardly hear his breathing. I instantly knew he was Philip. He wasn't merely a phantom or a haze. I hesitated, not knowing whether to confront him, flee, or speak. At least he didn't appear hostile. He was just there, like a silent, pale guardian, and I could see a great deal of grief or emptiness in his eyes. His eyes slowly rose, and I noticed a slight trembling in his lips. I tried to say his name, but my voice cracked, but he seemed to understand. I heard a quiet whisper that said, "Help me." Or perhaps I imagined it. I stepped toward him, my flashlight trembling, and placed it on the floor, hoping he would see that I meant no harm. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought the coffin creaked, but perhaps that was just my imagination. The air grew colder, and I felt a powerful gust swirl around us as if something beneath the ground was stirring. When I looked at Philip, my throat constricted as he put his cold hand on my arm. The sound kept coming again, a scraping sound that made me feel terrified. It felt more like the brush of an old, freezing wind than a child's hand. I'm not sure where the courage came from, but I reacted with unexpected resolve. I felt compelled to open that coffin and find out what was inside. I looked at Philip again, hoping he would lead the way as he always did. I went to the coffin and pushed on the lid, which resisted until finally giving way with a grim crack and a thick cloud of dust, as if centuries of imprisonment had left. Inside, there were half-decomposed bones, a tiny skull that looked like it belonged to a child, a rusted metal crucifix, and a photo that was damp and contained the same image I had found, but in worse shape. When I turned around, I saw Philip closer than ever, his face pleading, his eyes filled with terror and hope, as if he longed to explain some suffering he couldn't put into words. My heart was racing, and I was fighting to keep my cool, but then I heard a whisper against my ear, as if someone were calling my name. I noticed he was pointing at the skull. A horrifying idea suddenly crossed my mind. This was his body, and for some reason, I'm not sure why, he was confined here. My natural desire to assist led me to consider either blessing his remains or relocating them. I carefully removed the crucifix from the coffin because all I had was my will and my presence. As soon as I touched it, a loud roar that sounded like an old groan reverberated through the mellum, making the walls seem to vibrate. I got to my feet, G clutching the crucifix, and Philip looked up at the ceiling as though he knew what was about to happen. Suddenly, a freezing wind blew, throwing me against the wall and knocking the breath out of my lungs. Something inside the coffin jolted when I saw it. Philip retreated as though pulled by an unseen force, and then there was a loud crash, and my flashlight kept flickering. I felt like the place wanted to switch places with us, so I ran toward him and tried to hold him, but my hands went straight through him. He was ethereal, and I could feel his energy, his face near mine like a frozen lament piercing my flesh. So I began to pray. Clutching the crucifix with all of my strength, I whispered the few catechism's fragments I remembered from my childhood. I repeated those words like a mantra, pleading with whatever power might be listening to free that child's soul. When I opened my eyes, I noticed that Philip's silhouette was gradually disappearing. He gazed at me with such deep sorrow that it made my stomach turn, and then he vanished, leaving behind a fleeting swirl of wind. I stood there, stunned, wondering if this was the end of his suffering or just a delusion. Suddenly, the air became calm, my flashlight stopped flickering, and the room fell silent once more. I walked over to the coffin, carefully closed it, placed the crucifix on top of the dusty lid, and, in spite of my fear, I whispered goodbye. For some reason, I felt that was all I needed to say. It was my farewell to whoever had helped me grow up and come back to me as an adult. Several times, I told myself it was just a one-off incident or a fantasy from my early years. But then I feel a chill tug at my sleeve or hear a faint murmur in the darkness. And I realize there are things Philip's gaze endures in my memory beyond all natural explanation. And occasionally I feel it in the corners of my room. I don't have long conversations to share because Philip didn't say much, and I was at a loss for words during our last meeting. Everything was in our eyes, gestures, and sensations. Every time someone asks me about the most upsetting event in my life, I realize how brittle the barrier between this world and the next is. As I write these words, no other incident has frightened me as much or demonstrated to me so clearly that the dead do not always go away. I think of him with both fear and reverence. I picture his bare feet walking on the soggy grass in the cemetery and his eyes tracking my every move as I pass from grave to grave. I'm not a kid anymore, but some fears never go away. They only get worse. The cemetery in my hometown is still filled with stories that men and locals would rather not hear. Roots grow over time, feeding on silence, uncertainty, and sleepless nights. Sometimes we think we have freed ourselves from our ghosts, but it's never that simple, especially when we remember them so clearly. Every cemetery has its own horrors, with ghosts hiding in obscure corners and protecting an old secret. However, this one is mine. It is permanently engraved on my skin like a tattoo, and whenever I dare to close my eyes and allow my thoughts to wander, I find myself running among those headstones once more. After running through the rows of crosses, I turn to see a pale boy motioning for me to follow him. After reading the tombstone, I understand that time is meaningless to those who haven't really left, and I've done everything I can to relax. Candle lighting and prayers are ancient customs that ensure there is always some light and that no ghost can catch me in complete darkness. I've come to accept the persistent fear of the unfamiliar. I can assure anyone reading or hearing these words that there is no greater fear than the one born of confusion and doubt standing before a ghostly child who looks at you as an equal but doesn't know how to help him or free yourself from him. It's an experience that gawks at your sanity sometimes, and when memory fails me, at least by sharing my story, I feel like I can unload some of the burden I carry. But I don't tell it often for fear of being judged as crazy, or perhaps I am a bit unhinged by it all. Because of this, I haven't often told this story in detail, but today I'm writing it down in the hopes that someone will learn that a boy named Philip died in 1920 in the cemetery of my former hometown and continued to walk among the gravestones for nearly a century after his death. Even now, amidst the fog and the abandoned headstones, you can still feel his presence. I'm not sure if I'll ever go back there, but I feel like I'm meant to walk on the same parched leaves and look at the old Morum once more. I wonder if he'll be there in silence, with that same solemn face and eerie stare that makes me shudder. Perhaps he won't ever set. Maybe I'm the one who can't let go of him. All I know for sure is that every night when I close my eyes, his thin figure resurfaces, and my memories torment me with his half-erased face. A whisper from the past creeps into every attempt to move on, and even though it makes me cringe to think of seeing him again, I confess that I secretly hope he's finally found rest. This is the story I'll never be able to forget. The story of a dead boy who played with me when I didn't understand what death was, and who came back years later to demonstrate to me that some souls don't know how to leave. My name is Larry, and I'm from Grassland. I work cleaning tombs in a cemetery that stretches out on the outskirts of the city, where the silence and humidity feel like an unmanageable weight. Today, I dare to share my most terrifying story, which still haunts me every night when I close my eyes. I can't go a night without hearing footsteps echoing in dim hallways, murmuring along the walls of old niches, and shadows that appear to form behind my back. My heart still trembles every time I think about a real, terrifying incident that I will never be able to forget. I've been working at the cemetery for a few years now, and it almost became a part of my daily routine to walk among headstones with the same calm that others have when they stroll down office hallways. At first, it didn't affect me. I always thought that tombs were places where one could find a strange peace, as though the souls resting there kept watch over the silence and wouldn't allow anything sinister to disrupt their sleep. However, over time, I started to notice different things. Perhaps it was because I switched to working at night a few months ago in order to save money and better manage my time. Or perhaps I was just chosen, and I'm not sure how else to explain it. I saw it, felt it, and regrettably, I still carry it with me in my consciousness every night when I take my tools and walk the main pathways to remove dry leaves and clean flower vases. I swear, though, that there is a presence in that cemetery that is not of this world. Something that feeds on fear and draws energy from anyone who wanders alone among the graves. The cemetery is large, and some parts appear older than others, with colonial-style buildings that are cracked. Remove any weeds and arrange everything for any masses or visitors that might arrive the following day. The street lamps there hardly worked, and the stone angels and epars were worn down over time. I felt that every step I took triggered echoes that ran across the concrete and bounced back from all angles, but I never felt the place was empty because I was overcome with the certainty that I wasn't alone, that something moved among the mums, that some invisible force slithered around the crypts waiting for a clueless person to cross its path. As a result, I had to carry a flashlight because the main lighting wasn't enough to illuminate those corners where the wind blew with an eerie whistle. Sometimes my coworkers made jokes about me being overly sensitive or about watching too many scary movies. However, the days passed and my fears intensified when the moon was obscured by clouds. The air seemed to remain motionless during those moments when you wished you could hear anything to relieve the tension, like a cricket or a faint sound. But complete silence is far worse because your mind tricks you into hearing things that might not exist or may exist but are just out of your line of sight. That was the atmosphere I encountered one November night when the cemetery appeared to be asleep and I was using my flashlight to make sure everything was in order because I needed to check some niches close to a large family tomb. I was left in total darkness when my flashlight abruptly died, revealing a scene that must have been majestic in its day but now displayed cracks and abandonment. I stayed motionless for a short while in the hopes that my eyes would get used to the darkness because I thought perhaps the batteries had died. As if someone or something were holding their breath near me, the air felt heavier. I didn't pay much attention at first because I thought it was moss or just wet stone when I reached out to feel the wall and felt something cold and damp. After a little while, I noticed a dim flicker from a street lamp in the distance, nearly dying but enough to guide me. Thinking that I might try to turn on another lamp or run into the security guard at the entrance, I headed toward that dim light. However, as I was moving forward, I felt as though I was stepping on something odd, like tiny pieces of stone or glass shards. I looked down, but the darkness only showed my shoe. Something told me that I shouldn't kneel down to look, and that I shouldn't stand there for another second with a dead flashlight in my hand. This gave me an unreasonable panic. I'm not sure how far I walked before the street lamp appeared to flicker, but when I eventually stood underneath it, I looked around and felt a chill go down my spine as though someone was watching me from the corner of their eye. But when I turned, I only saw mums and crosses. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt like something was playing with me, pulling me from one non-existent point of light to another as if it wanted me lost in the night. I tried to calm down, took a deep breath, and reminded myself that these kinds of incidents weren't impossible because street lights frequently flicker, because when I pointed my useless flashlight into the emptiness, I couldn't turn it on because my hand was shaking. I considered screaming, but my voice cracked in my throat, and I was paralyzed. It wasn't wind or an animal sound. The murmur grew louder and then suddenly stopped, as if someone had closed a door, leaving my heart racing wildly. The ensuing silence felt even worse because my mind was having a hard time processing the abrupt change from such an upsetting sound to nothing at all. I made the decision to leave there in an attempt to get to the main corridor, where I knew a switch occasionally illuminated a section of the more recent graves. Part of me begged that this was all in my head as I walked along one of the dirt paths. But another part of me knew something wasn't right because every step sounded abnormally loud. At the back of my neck, I felt like I was being watched, and every time I stepped, my boots kicked up a light dust that hung in the air and stuck to the marble walls and iron crosses. The sky appeared starless and dull, with the moon hidden behind a thick layer of clouds far away. An owl made a piercing screech that made me jump, catch my breath, and realize that I was soaked in sweat despite the cold night. My mind started racing with tales I had heard from other employees. I recalled one who said he saw a white woman walking around the graves with her face covered. Another who vowed that at night the old crypts made sobbing noises, and a third who claimed that occasionally a child would appear among the oldest headstones before disappearing. Absent a trace, I'd always viewed these stories with suspicion, believing they were the product of superstition or a desire to frighten newcomers. But now that I was engulfed in darkness and suspected that all those apparitions might actually have a foundation, I couldn't ignore the dread or the chill that was engulfing me. My hands, weighing on my chest, clung to the ineffective FL light like an illusionary anchor. In the midst of the gloom, I was able to come to a fork in the cemetery's paths. To my left was the area with more recent niches, and to my right was the older section with deteriorating monuments and small hallways. I swear I wanted to go left, but I heard something hit stone to my right with a dull thud. Trying not to look that way, I stopped in my tracks, but my eyes moved naturally in the darkness. I saw a faint movement, like a figure slowly floating away, and I swallowed hard, trying to tell myself it was only a trick of the light. But for some reason, I felt compelled to follow that shadow into the old section's labyrinth. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was a call I couldn't ignore. So I started to move cautiously while holding on to my broken flashlight. Every step caused wet grass to brush against my feet and dried twigs to snap beneath my feet. The silence was so deep that I could practically hear my heartbeat. A subtle scent of wilted flowers hung in the air, mingled with the strong smell of damp earth. The trees that surrounded that area of the cemetery created twisted shadows against the walls. Those silhouettes appeared to be mocking me by dancing all of a sudden. Since I usually like to make sure these structures are locked to prevent damage or theft, I didn't remember seeing it open like that before. I walked a few more yards and stopped in front of a melon with a rusted IR gate hanging ajar. The shadow I was following seemed to slip inside, and I felt a chill go through my body. I considered running away, but something made me face my fear. I entered the melon, which was a small area with stairs leading down to a small underground room, and was greeted by the smell of mold and stale humidity. I turned on my phone's flashlight because I couldn't rely on my flashlight that I would have preferred to flee, but my feet felt rooted to the ground, my heart thumping so hard I thought I might faint at any moment, and a crushing weight pressed down on my chest as if the air had become unbreathable. Its feeble beam just barely revealed the shape of a half-open coffin, dusty and covered in cobwebs. In the dim light from my phone, a stooped figure in ancient attire slowly emerged behind the coffin, as if it had just woken up from a protracted nap. For a moment, I wanted to think it was a trick of the shadows, but its dark eyes shone with a sinister gleam, and its skin looked pale and wrinkled. The figure moved awkwardly, its bones appearing to creak with each step. What was most terrifying was the silence with which it approached. It didn't shuffle its feet or make any noise other than a faint rustle of fabric that made my hair stand on end. I tried to scream and call for help, but all that came out was a strangled whisper. The figure tipped its head to one side with a trembling motion like a spasm, its eyes full of hunger, and its cracked lips parted slightly, releasing a frigid breath that enveloped me in incomprehensible cold. I backed up and felt the cold wall behind me. The thought suddenly struck me that this corner could also become my grave. I'm not sure where I got the strength from the beer, but I was able to move my legs and run up the stairs without thinking twice. Desperate to get out, I stumbled on the last stair and fell against the rusty door, which screamed loudly. As I scurried to get up, I heard a deep moaning sound coming from inside the morsum, and something made my blood freeze. I ran without looking back, jumping over nearby tombs and avoiding broken monuments as I slammed that door shut with all the force I could muster, not knowing if the latch would hold. I was alone with my panting breath and my frantic footsteps echoing in the hallways. I finally arrived at a place. I immediately recognized the area of older niches where wilted flowers were stacked and water was constantly dripping. A small lamp stood in the corner, and although it occasionally worked and occasionally didn't, I was able to turn it on by slapping its base a few times. The light was flickering and yellowish, but it provided me with a little comfort. I made an effort to relax by making my mind come up with a logical explanation. Even though the image of that pale skin and the sound of those creaking bones convinced me it wasn't just a person, I still refused to believe in the supernatural until my fear reminded me that many things in this world defy logical explanation. Perhaps it was an elderly man in tattered clothes who had found refuge in the cemetery, or a homeless person hiding there. The paths appeared strange, as if the cemetery had changed shape, stretching its walls and forming new forks. But I concluded that the best course of action was to go to the main exit and call for assistance. I felt trapped in a maze of gray walls and crosses, and I couldn't recognize anything. Every corridor seemed to lead to a different place, and every morsum door looked the same. To make things worse, a cold wind started blowing, causing branches to creak and a ghostly whistle to swirl through the corners. My skin prickled, and I began to pray quietly, asking God to show me a way out so that I wouldn't be abandoned in this place full of cursed presences. After walking for what seemed like an eternity, I noticed a faint glow in the distance, possibly from a lamp or flashlight. I ran toward it in the hopes of finding a guard or a coworker, but as I got closer, I noticed the silhouette of a man with his back turned, crouching next to a group of misaligned tombs. I called out, but my voice was shaky, and he didn't respond. I cautiously circled around him and noticed that he was holding a shovel. He moved slowly, as though digging or scratching at the ground. But there was no deep hole. His hands were covered in dirt, and his clothing was just as outdated as the figure I had seen in the melon. His eyes were hollow and blank, as if he were not even alive. His lips parted in a hideous manner, and he didn't blink. A guttural sound came from his throat, chilling me to my core. I staggered back, trying not to fall, and then I turned and stumbled away, blinded by terror. All I wanted was to get away from this nightmare and reach the Eerie gates. The headstones surrounding me appeared to be shifting the shadows, extending and contracting at will, playing with my senses. The few functioning street lamps appeared to flicker as the freezing wind continued to blow. Using my broken flashlight as a brace, I pulled myself up and limped toward a path that I knew led to the area where children's graves were located. That place always gave me chills even during the day, but in that moment, I was relieved to finally see my family again. I tripped over a marble base and fell to my knees, pain shooting up my leg as I hit the ground. When I looked down, I saw blood staining my pants. I cried out in agony, almost ready to collapse right there. Thinking that maybe it would be better to let it all end, that I was relieved to finally know where I was and that the only way I could get out onto a side street was to climb over the metal gate at the end of that walkway on the right. As I trudged forward, I saw the small tombs with their angels and old toys, and I felt as though childish shadows and porcelain eyes were watching me every move. The silence was heavier still, like a veil over any noise or sign of life, and when I finally reached the gate, it was locked with a thick padlock, but I thought I could force it or at least climb it. While gasping for air, I started to climb it using my good leg on the metal bars. The iron was freezing against my skin, but I was so desperate that I felt a violent yank that almost sent me flying backward on instinct. I clung to the top of the gate with one hand while attempting to free myself with the other, only to discover that the hand holding me was skeletal, ice cold, and had long fingers that dug into my clothing like claws. Even though I didn't want to, I couldn't help but notice a pale face with empty eyes and a distressed look. There was a continuous gasp as a sort of hissing moan escaped from its mouth. Was it the same creature or something similar? A muffled moan came from the other side of the gate, and I stumbled away limping until I reached a street lamp. I looked back at the cemetery and saw only the shadows of the walkways, everything drowned in a terrible darkness. I didn't know, but the adrenaline rushing through me caused me to lash out with my injured leg. I felt its grip loosen, and in an instant I managed to break free and fall onto the sidewalk outside, landing hard on the pavement. The impact rattled me, but the relief of finally being outside overcame everything else, and I briefly thought I might see a face pressed up against the iron bars, but there was nothing. It was raining on that empty street, and all I could feel was a tightness in my chest, knowing that what was behind those walls couldn't be readily explained. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should call the police or just flee. But when I finally collected my thoughts, I found the strength to go home without telling anyone. The trip was unbearable, and I thought I saw a ghostly face or a figure in the shadows watching me from every corner. It was the worst night of my life, and even now, knowing that there are things beyond our comprehension, I narrate it with a trembling voice because I couldn't get the memory of those creatures that seemed to emerge from coffins and the earth with empty eyes and an endless look of sorrow. When the sun rose the following morning, I made myself go back to the cemetery with a coworker I had persuaded to come, despite his skepticism. We looked over the areas I had described, but everything seemed to be as it should be. The melon door was locked with an intact padlock, and the interior was dusty and deserted with no signs of open coffins. My supervisors asked me if I had ever seen anyone out late, but I was unable to provide them with many specifics. They gave me a few days off, even though they could tell my explanation wasn't very compelling because I made up a story about thieves or intruders to avoid coming across as crazy. I changed my shift to avoid working nights after that experience, but sometimes even during the day I feel like something is watching me from the old crypts, as if it marked me in my nightmares. I frequently see cadaverous hands pulling me into the dark and hear that raspy murmur, and I wonder if those entities or presences are looking for punishment or companionship. As the days go by, I've become almost paranoid. People say that when something evil chooses you, it doesn't let go so easily. I've heard footsteps behind me even outside the cemetery, and more than once I swear I saw a dark shape in the corner of my bedroom. People tell me it's all in my head, that fear and suggestion can be powerful, but I know what I went through. I've prayed, I've sought blessings, and on some days I feel a slight relief, but I never regained the confidence I once had walking among tombs. I am aware of how I felt. There are painful silences and soul-piercing stares. Cemeteries that contain not only the bodies of the deceased but also something else, unnamed, that lies beneath the earth and emerges at the darkest hours of the night. And Imar from Savannah, Georgia, who merely wished to make a living cleaning as long as I don't talk about it. I hope no one else ever experiences what I did. Graves became a witness to a horror that will follow me until the day I'm laid to rest. Telling you this feels like a weight being lifted off my shoulders, but I'm also afraid of waking whatever sleeps there, which might remain at peace. No one else is compelled by terror to flee into the night, their heart clenched and goosebumps on their skin. I share this testimony with people who are looking for the truth because sometimes the real world is much more unsettling than urban legends. And the ghosts we write about are nothing compared to the presences that prowl the halls of a cemetery in the early hours of the morning. My terrible testimony comes to an end because I'll never fully understand what those hunched figures were or why they picked me. But I'm confident that the graves where I work aren't as empty as we like to think. Deep in the darkness, something waits hungry beneath the earth.